Hello there, and welcome back to the LRJ Chess channel. In this second video, we're going to have a two-part video on all the basic chess rules. We're going to start with how the pieces move in this one, and in the second video, you'll have all of the other essential rules. So without further ado, let's see how the pieces move. So let's start with your most important piece, the king. The entire game of chess revolves around this piece. You want to protect your own king, and you want to try and destroy your opponent's king. But we'll get into all of these specifics later in the second video. For now, let's just go through the king's movement. You may be surprised to know that despite it being your most important piece in the entire game, the king is really weak. He can barely move anywhere, and he requires defense and basically babysitting by all of the other pieces. The good thing about the king, his movement pattern is super easy to learn. Let's check it out. So here we are, finally getting to the chessboard. Most of my lessons and videos will feature positions I have collected in my ChessBase database. For more info on ChessBase, check the description down below. But please note that this program is very expensive and really only needed for players moving up into the expert or master sections and above. With that little side note out of the way, let's take a look at the king's movement. And thankfully, it's pretty simple. The king can move one square in every direction, all highlighted in green. When it's in the center of the board, the king can go to 8 different squares. When it's in the corner of the board, the king can go to 3 different squares. This distinction will be important for every piece, and you'll soon see why. Second, we have the bishop. This guy is limited to moving only on one diagonal of the same color that it sits on, such as this. That's why you have 2 bishops to start the game. One controls the dark squares, and the other controls the light squares. When a bishop is in the center of the board, it can go to 13 different squares. When it's in the corner of the board instead, the bishop can only go to 7 squares. Next is the rook. Many people call this piece the castle, and I think you can see why. The rook moves in a plus shape, up, down, and left and right. It's more powerful than the bishop because it's not limited to the colored square that it's currently sit on. It can go to both light and dark squares alike. When a rook is in the center of the board, it can go to 14 different squares, all along the rank, which is the horizontal line of a chessboard, and file, which is the vertical line of a chessboard. I'll be talking about diagonals, ranks, and files a lot, so just remember what direction they go in. When a rook is in the corner of the board, it can also go to 14 squares. That's interesting. No matter if it's in the middle of the board or the corner of the board, the rook can still go to the same number of squares. That'll definitely be important to remember later on. But what's even more interesting is this next piece, the queen. The queen can move up, down, left, right, and also along the diagonals. Imagine if you took a rook and you put a bishop right on top of it. Their combined movement would be equal to the queen. When the queen is in the center of the board, she can go to 27 different squares. That's definitely a lot. When the queen is in the corner of the board, she can go to 21 squares. That's still a lot. Now, there are still 2 pieces that I haven't talked about, and that's because they're the trickiest. If you feel comfortable moving the king, the bishop, the rook, and the queen, let's dive into those tricky pieces. The first one is the knight. This guy has a very unique type of movement.
The knight moves in an L shape. On the screen are arrows pointing to the different squares that the knight could move to. The key here is to see that each knight move is made up of two parts. The first one is a one square step up, down, left, or right. Then the second part is a two square step in another direction. If the knight had gone up one the first time, it can go to the left or to the right to make an L shape. If he went down, it would also go to the left or to the right. If the knight went to the right one, it could go up or down. And if the knight went to the left, it could go up or down. In any case, notice how the final squares over here, highlighted in red, are ones that you can get to by making a one square move in any main direction, up, down, left, or right, followed by a two square move in a direction that is opposite of the one you chose before. So if the one square move was up or down, the two square move has to be left or right, and vice versa for if your first square move was left or right. These two parts could also be switched around. The knight could start by making a two square jump in either direction, followed by a one square move in the opposite direction, just like before. As I highlight the squares, notice how the same exact squares are being highlighted. No matter if you move the knight one square first or two squares first, you'll end up getting to the same square as long as you move it in an L shape. That combination of a one square jump and a two square jump. When the knight is in the center of the board, it can go to 8 different squares. When the knight is in the corner of the board, it can only go to 2 different squares. So far, that's the weakest piece we've seen from the corner. Let me tell you one more thing about the knight's trickiness. Knights are the only piece that can jump over other pieces, both yours and your opponent. Let's take a look at an example position to show that. While other pieces, like this bishop, can't move past the pawns, the knight can. The knight is able to jump over this wall of pawns and move to squares in front of them, while the bishop is not able to pass the pawns. Must be nice to have this kind of freedom. It definitely does make up for the short range movement of the knight. And when we talk about capturing pieces later on in this video, you'll see how important the ability to jump over pieces can be. This kind of uniqueness makes the knight my favorite piece, and I know a lot of other people feel the same way as well. If you're feeling a little bit discouraged that the knight's movement is too tricky for you, don't worry. There are a lot of other people that feel the same way, and everything will get better with practice. But if you feel comfortable with moving the knight, let's move on to the final piece, the pawn. This little guy is your foot soldier. He's the weakest piece of them all, but that's why at the start of a chess game, you get 8 of them in total. The pawn is the weakest piece because its mobility is the most restricted. Let's pause for a second. The word mobility may not be one that you've heard before, but it's a very important term in the game of chess. Let's move away from the board for a second and do a little lesson on the word mobility. A good definition of mobility is the ability to move freely. So something that is more mobile or has more mobility means that it can move more freely than something else. In terms of chess, a piece that has more mobility means that it can move to more squares than other pieces. Since your queen can move to at most 27 squares, She is your most mobile piece in your army by far, and by extension, your most powerful piece because of it. Okay, if you think you have a good grasp on the term mobility, let's continue talking about your little foot soldiers. A pawn is only able to move 1 square forward. The pawn is also your only piece that cannot move backwards. But now, here's a big change. When your pawn is on its starting square, it has a choice. It can move up 1 square, or it can move up 2 squares. However, the ability to move a pawn 2 squares is only reserved for its very first move. And get this, the pawn's ability to move 2 steps on its starting move instead of 1 was introduced in Spain in 1280. That was 744 years ago. I think that's a cool piece of trivia.
Hello again, we're back here. Now that you know how all the pieces move, it's time to turn to their values. Each piece in chess has the same exact purpose. They want to defend your king and attack the opponent. But the way they're able to move will determine their value to you in a chess game. On the screen is a depiction of each piece and the squares that they can move to. The king is invaluable. He's the main focus of the game. He cannot be captured. The pawn is the weakest, as seen by its limited movement. The knight and bishop have a similar value, mainly because the bishop's long-ranged ability makes up for its limitation to only 1 colored square, while the knight has the most unique abilities out of every chess piece, but it is a short-ranged piece. The rook is stronger than both the knight and the bishop because of its heightened mobility, while the queen is obviously the strongest piece. As you can see, piece value increases when mobility and usefulness increases. Now, in the chess community, there's a common understanding that each piece has a specific value attached to it on a point system. For example, a pawn is worth 1 point. A knight is worth 3 points. A bishop is also worth 3 points. A rook is worth 5 points. And your queen, your most powerful piece, is worth 9 points. Now, this point system is put into place to show the increasing value of each piece. But despite how widespread this system is, I just don't agree with it. I think there's one big problem here, and that it amounts each piece's value to a specific number. And that's not always the case. The more you study chess and the more you learn about it, the more you'll realize that each piece's value corresponds more to how useful and how mobile they can be to you and your army. So what I would suggest to you, after learning this piece value system and knowing that a rook is stronger than a bishop, a queen is stronger than a rook, and etc., I want to make sure that you understand that a piece's mobility is way more important than the value attached to it. Think about it this way. A rook is not always worth 5 points. There could be a position where it's much better or much worse. Same with a knight. A knight could have no squares to go to, or it could be sitting in a corner. That's not a 3-point value piece. That piece is useless. There could also be a situation where a knight is stronger than a rook. Could you think of one? Leave it down below in the comments if you can. Also, when comparing material differences by points, it can get pretty difficult to see who actually has the advantage. Let's take a look at 3 examples and I'll show you why. First, would you rather have a bishop or 3 pawns? Would you rather have a rook and a pawn or a knight and a bishop? For the last example, would you rather have a queen or a knight and 6 pawns? In all 3 cases, we have the same conclusion, which is equal points. But as you can realize, in each of those situations, there was no such thing as equal material. It was not bishop for bishop or rook for rook. It was a different combination of pieces that amounted to the same value of points. See how that can get confusing? A lot of people would say that's equal material, but if you look at the board, it's not. It's just equal points. The most important thing that I want you to take away from here is that equal points does not mean equal material. If you can think about the value of a chess piece as how useful or mobile they can be, then you'll eventually get a much better understanding of the whole game than someone who just blindly attributes point values to these pieces. Well, I might have gotten a little off track there with that mini rant on the piece value system, but I think there is one important takeaway. Understanding why something happens in chess is super important to your growth. Memorization will not help long-term growth. Sure, it'll help you in the short term to learn something quickly, but you may just forget about it in a week, in a month, whenever. If you understand why something is happening in chess, you're going to remember that for a long time, and that's going to help you improve in the long run. My goal here is to teach you the whys of chess. I want to help you build an understanding of this entire game. So with that, if there's ever a why you don't understand in one of my videos, just leave a comment down below and hopefully I can help clear it up for you. With that said, let's now move on to how to capture pieces. Knowing how all the pieces move is great, but there's one thing that's missing: knowing how to capture enemy pieces. In chess, the goal is to destroy the opponent's position. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to capture the enemy pieces that are defending his king. You're going to be doing this a lot in chess, so the following examples will show you how each piece can capture an enemy piece. Let's go back to the board and check it out.
So here we have a pretty odd position, but this position is actually going to help you learn how to capture pieces. So to take an enemy piece, you must have your piece in the same line of sight as your opponent's piece. This could be your bishop on the same diagonal as your opponent's rook, just like this, or your queen on the same rank as the opponent's knight, like this. In both cases, the bishop is looking at the rook and the queen is looking at the knight. So in either of these cases, the white piece could capture the black piece. It could move onto the square where the rook is or the knight is and take that piece. But for a pawn, remember that pawns can only capture a piece one diagonal to the left or to the right of it. So if we take a look at this white pawn over here, it could capture the pawn diagonally to the left of it or diagonally to the right of it, but it cannot capture the pawn directly in front of it. That will not work. For something as important as capturing pieces, we need even more example positions. You should see 4 positions on the screen right now. In one of these positions, neither side can capture an enemy piece. Can you figure out which one that is? Feel free to pause the video if you need some more time. All right. Hopefully you have your answers locked in because we're gonna go review these positions. All right, so here we go. We're gonna look at the first position out of the 4 that were on the screen. This one is shown from Black's point of view, and there's only one capture in this position. If we take a look at the few pieces that are on the board, you'll see that the bishop looks along this diagonal and looks along this diagonal. And on one of these diagonals is a white piece. So the bishop is able to capture this pawn on the side of the board. And this is the only capture that Black has in this position. So that's position 1. Let's move on to position number 2 now. So this was position number 2. We're looking at it from White's point of view. In this position, there are no captures. So if you said position number 2 as your answer, you would be correct. But let's look into it and see why there are no captures. Black has two long-ranged pieces in his rook and his bishop, but if I draw out the squares that this piece can go to, we'll end up seeing that none of these squares in range of the bishop or the rook have a white piece on them. So the black pieces are not able to capture anything. And for white, his shorter range knight can't actually attack anything. It gets close to the bishop, but it's not close enough. So the knight can't capture anything, and neither can the rook. The rook doesn't have many squares to go to. As a reminder, you cannot capture your own pieces, so this position has no captures possible. On to position number 3, where we're looking at this from black's point of view again. While there are a lot of pieces on the board, there's actually only one black piece that can capture something, and that would be the queen. Remember, the queen has a huge range of motion, can go up and down, left and right, and also along the diagonals. So if we look along the queen's line of sight, you'll find that there are two pieces the queen can capture. Now you may be looking at this pawn thinking, well, if the queen takes the pawn, then the enemy queen could actually take black's queen. Let's take a look at that variation a little bit farther. If the black queen captures this pawn, you are definitely correct that the enemy queen can recapture. But then if you look one step further, you'll see the black rook on the back rank can now capture this queen. While the rook wasn't able to take anything on the first turn, by capturing this pawn and having the queen be captured right back, now the rook has an extra range because it's not being blocked by its own queen. So the rook could take the queen. That wins one pawn, but there's something even better that black can do. If we take a look at the other capture, the black queen can capture the white knight over here. Now if we compare these two captures, one of them wins a pawn and the other one wins a knight. Since we know a knight is stronger than a pawn, this would be the preferred capture. In this position, if it were black to move in an actual game, black would most likely choose to capture this knight. All right, and now on to the final position. In this position, there are 5 different captures, so let's go through each one of them. Starting with the queen first as your most powerful piece, the queen can capture this pawn, and it can also capture this bishop. Moving on to your rook, it can also capture the bishop, and it can take this pawn as well. And lastly, for the 5th capture, your bishop can take this pawn near the king and the rook. So there are 5 captures in this position, but each one would get your piece taken. So whether or not it would be a good move would need further investigation. But for right now, we're just trying to find all of the captures, and this one had 5.
And we're back from the puzzles. By the way, I want you to know that you'll be finding a lot more of these little quizzes in my videos, because I think they're the easiest way to learn new material. You have a couple examples, you get to think about it, and then you get to test your knowledge. And if you get 100% on those quizzes, that shows you really know what's going on. And that's a great marker for growth. But from these exercises specifically, I really want to make sure that you are looking out for pieces to capture. Put simply, if you're able to capture more of your opponent's pieces, that will most likely make winning the game that much easier. And as one final note, and this is really important to remember, you can only capture your opponent's pieces. You can't capture your own pieces. Think about your army as just that, an army. Your pieces need to work together to protect each other and to attack the opponent. So there can't be any fighting among the ranks. All right, let's take a break here of talking about puzzles and quizzes and just jump into one more. If you can answer these next quiz questions correctly, then you surely know how the pieces move and how they capture. If you get some of them wrong, don't worry. There are 6 distinct pieces in chess, and they all move in wildly different ways, following different rules along the way. It's definitely going to be confusing, especially if you're learning chess for the first time. But just know that once you get over that hurdle and you know how the pieces move, you're going to feel so much better about your chess. I always like to say that hard work pays off, and this is something that you can see going through these quizzes, failing them, trying again, and succeeding. And by the way, I'll leave the puzzles up for 5 seconds each, so you can have some time to think about it. But if you can't solve it in that time, feel free to pause the video. Chess is about taking time too. So you want to make sure you're thinking through each position and making sure your thought process is not being cut off anywhere. Now, without further ado, let's get into quiz question number 1.
How many squares could this knight move to? Question number 2. When your pawn is on this square, is it able to go up 2 squares or only 1? Why or why not? Question number 3. Can a bishop that starts on the bottom left corner ever move to the bottom right corner? Why or why not? Question number 4. How many squares could the white rook move to? And question number 5. How many pieces could the white queen capture?
And with that final question out of the way, you're done with the quiz. Congratulations! But we're not finished just yet. With these 5 quiz questions out of the way, it's time to review them all. They're fresh in your mind, so let's go back to the board.
So this was question number 1, asking how many squares the knight could move to. And if we follow along the L-shape pattern of the knight, we can see that the knight has 6 squares that it can go to in this position. So the correct answer would be 6. On to position number 2. We were looking at a pawn on this square, and I asked if it could move up 2 squares or not. The answer here would be no. This pawn is not on its starting square. A pawn's starting square is on the 2nd rank for white, or the 7th rank for black. Basically, 1 rank higher than the bottom one for both sides. A pawn can only move up 2 squares when it's on its starting square. So seeing how this pawn is not on its starting square, the correct answer for question number 2 would be no. The pawn cannot move up 2 squares. It can only move up 1 square from now on. On to question number 3, where I asked if a bishop on the left corner could ever move onto the bottom right corner. So the answer to this question would also be no. Remember that a bishop is limited to only 1 color square. And the color of the bottom left-hand corner and the bottom right-hand corner are 2 different colors. So this bishop could never get onto the bottom right-hand corner. On to question number 4, where I asked how many squares could the rook move to? This puzzle could be simply figured out by counting all of the squares. Remember that a rook moves in a plus shape, up, down, left, and right. So if we take a look at the squares, if we look down, it could go to 1 square. It cannot move on to the square that the king could go to. It could go to any one of these squares. It cannot move to where the pawn is. It can go to these 2 squares. And it can go to these 4 squares. Since this black pawn is on the line of sight of the rook, the white rook can actually go to that square and capture the pawn. So in the end, there are 10 squares that the rook could move to in this position. And for the last puzzle question, I asked, how many pieces could the white queen capture in this position? So the queen moves like a bishop and a rook, up, down, left, and right, and on the diagonals. So if we draw out the queen's line of sight, all we have to do is check if there are any black pieces that hit on this line of sight. So as we can already see, there are a lot. The white queen can capture a pawn. It can capture the enemy queen. It can capture a pawn over here. And it can capture the bishop. So the correct answer here would be that the white queen can capture 4 pieces.
All right, the review for each 5 puzzle is complete. We're back here again. Let me know how you did on the quiz in the comments down below. I'd like to see if you got 100%. I'd even like to see if you got 0%. Please do not feel conflicted about posting that. Chess is about growth, chess is about learning, chess is about failure and learning from your mistakes. If you post a 0% there, I know that there's stuff that I can do to help you. But now, with the quiz and the review done, it's time to take a break from all of these pieces and how they move. Believe it or not, you've just taken a big step in your chess journey. Moving the pieces is a huge part of playing the game of chess. The next thing we'll do is tackle the rest of the rules that you'll need in chess. They'll deal with specifics about moving, about winning the game, and about everything else. But right now, I'm just going to leave you with how the pieces move and how they capture. I think that's enough for this video for now. Until we get into the next one, this is LRJ Chess, signing off with a checkmate. See you in the next video.